Hi, I'm Jennifer Cohn, and I'm here today with John Brakey, Chris Potter, Susan Pinchon, and Benny Smith, all of Audit USA. And we are here to discuss a new lawsuit that they have filed in Florida, which involves the integrity of Florida elections and preserving the integrity of the elections in 2020. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Thank you.
So first, John, I was hoping to speak with you since you're the founder of Audit USA. Could you describe for us the mission of Audit USA and what type of work you guys do?
Well, we've been around since 2004. Susan, me, even though I didn't know Susan until 2005 or 6. Our mission is the same. We are a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to restore public ownership and oversight of elections, to work to ensure that the fundamental right of every American citizen to vote and to have each vote counted as intended in a secure, transparent, impartial, independent, audited election process. That's what we work for. It's not about the right or left for us. It's about right and wrong. And when you do it for 16 years, you add to it. It's not about the right or left. It's about right and wrong, greed, and corruption, because elections are about money. And we work very hard, and our philosophy is to make elections transparent, trackable, and publicly verified. The message that we try to get out to people is that, voting is a secret process, but counting is a public process, and we've lost our way. I've known about these ballot images because of the way my mind works. Nothing is fixed till I know why it broke. I wrote my first paper on ballot images and what could be done as early as 2006, and I knew it was coming.
Sorry to interrupt. You mentioned ballot images, and that is, I believe, the focus of your new lawsuit. And I'm hoping that someone here on our panel can explain for me what a ballot image is. How about Chris?
Well, actually, what about Susan?
How about Susan? Sure.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi there.
Hi. Well, when you vote on a paper ballot, you put that ballot in a voting machine, which is called a scanner. And the scanners nowadays are digital scanners. And that digital scanner takes essentially a picture of your ballot, and the votes are counted from the picture, not from the paper ballot itself. So that picture is called a ballot image. And our concern has been that those images should be preserved because they're counting the votes, but that many jurisdictions, including over half of Florida counties, are deleting or destroying those images.
Wow. Okay. Which brings us, I know you filed lawsuits in the past, John, about ballot image preservation, and this new one is in Florida. And I'm hoping that Chris, as the attorney for Audit USA, can describe for me what this new lawsuit is about.
Well, we have filed procedurally. It is kind of a combination of a mandamus, declaratory, injunctive relief lawsuit. We're trying to come at it from all angles because mandamus, which is an action to require that a public official do what's plainly required of him or her under law, the standard for getting that is very high. So we've come at it from a couple of angles. But our objective is to get, we have two sets of defendants. We have the secretaries, we have state defendants, the Secretary of State and the Florida Director of Elections. And then we have 8 supervisors of elections. Those are the lead election officials for each county. They're called supervisors of elections. And so we're seeking those two sets of defendants. We're seeking relief from both of them. From the state defendants, we're asking that they either promulgate rules that include the preservation of ballot images, and or send directives to each of the 67 supervisors of elections in Florida, informing them that it is the law of the United States of America and the state of Florida that all election materials, including digital ballot images, must be preserved for 22 months following an election.
Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry.
In a nutshell.
And you have some pretty high-profile plaintiffs, is that right?
Well, there are 12 plaintiffs. They include the Democratic Party of Florida, 3 legislators, 2 are state representatives, and 1's a state senator. We have 1 candidate for supervisor of elections, and then we have a variety of citizens and activists, including Susan Pinchon, who is a plaintiff in this action.
It really struck me that you were able to get the Florida Democratic Party to join as a plaintiff in this litigation. That must give the litigation, I would think, a big boost. How did that come to pass?
Well, the Democratic Party has been fighting for accountability in the elections at least since 2000. So it wasn't a very hard sell.
Did you call them, or did they contact you?
Well, what happened was when John and I decided, in consultation with Susan, that we needed to do something in Florida to compel compliance with the law. Having worked in Florida, not just in 2000, but in 2016 and 2018, I actually represented the Florida Democratic Party in 2018 on the two statewide recounts. So we hooked up with a couple of lawyers who were closely allied with the Florida Democratic Party, Ben Cooney and Joe Geller, who is also a plaintiff and a state representative. He's wearing 3 hats here. And both those people are people I worked closely with in 2000, during the 2000 recount, and worked with in 2016 because I was in Miami doing voter protection, and in 2018 on the statewide recount. So these are people I'd worked with for a long time. I forget who exactly suggested that we try to get the Democratic Party involved, but we reached out to them formally, and they said yes. And then Joe Geller was able to persuade 2 of his colleagues at the legislature join up, and most of the citizens came to us either through Susan or John through their networks.
Okay, thanks. So just to summarize, this is in essence a lawsuit that seeks to preserve the digital ballot images that are automatically created by these digital scanners throughout Florida, to have them preserved rather than destroyed.
That's right.
Preserved as public images. And this is based in part on federal law, is that right? Which requires the preservation.
That's right. Now, it's a little complicated. We brought a case in federal court in 2018 seeking the same relief. And the federal judge, Mark Walker, who's a very good judge on voting rights issues, dismissed the case in a dismissal that was kind of a kiss. He said, he in essence said, you're right on the merits, but the federal law does not provide a private right of action. And just to explain, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but the federal law was originally a part of the 1960 Civil Rights Act. And at that time, their concern was that African-American voters were trying to register for the first time and participate in the voting process. And unsympathetic, I'll put it that way, unsympathetic election officials were deep sixing the materials of voter registration or any. So that when the federal agents came in and said, we understand that you're not letting John Smith vote, they said, well, we have no record of him.
Right.
So that law, actually signed by President Eisenhower, went into effect right around the time of the Kennedy administration, which was very activist in this area. And
Right.
the thinking was that if the Congress left enforcement of that act with the Justice Department, that the Justice Department was the proper vehicle for enforcement. Well, the Justice Department hasn't touched this statute since the 60s. So
Right. And it's not certainly
it's
not
not
going to
likely, not
under Trump.
likely, yeah, in the current administration. So anyway, Judge Walker dismissed it on those grounds, even though he said, in effect, that you have a good case here. So what we've done in state court, we filed this in state court in Tallahassee, Leon County, which is actually a county that is preserving. But we filed it in state court, and we combined the state requirements to preserve public records with this obligation, this federal obligation to preserve for 22 months. So it's really being, in effect, brought under state law. But
interesting.
We've included the state statute to demonstrate to the court that there is a clear federal obligation to preserve these ballot images as well as state, under state law. So that is our theory, and we hope that it works this time.
Okay. Thank you. Am I right that there are about 67 counties total in Florida, and then it would be about 40 of them that are not preserved images?
Yeah. Now, give or take, I think we were able to confirm one of there's an activist who have worked with John and with Susan named Sean Hunter, who
he's terrific. I know him also.
Who actually filed records requests in all 67. So it's his work that we relied on, followed up by Susan's. Now, we've only sued eight counties, and our thinking there was that these counties were representative. They actually comprised, the voting population comprises 55% of the total voting population in Florida. So
you got the big guns, kind of.
I think
Palm Beach and Dade.
I think we feel that the dominoes will fall if we get these.
Okay, so as I understand it, from speaking with Susan earlier today, that the notion, well, as a matter of just fact, it really can't be disputed. These images are automatically created, and that this is actually how digital scanners count the paper ballots, is with these images. So it isn't something like you have to switch a button to create the images. They're automatically created. But the defendants are maybe trying to do something, it appears anyway, that they're trying to do something a little bit clever and suggest that what you're asking them to do is create images, and therefore, and they have no obligation to create something that doesn't already exist. And that seems to be kind of their defense, but it's really a fallacy because
we didn't get that far. We didn't get that far in the state, in the federal lawsuit. They filed a motion to dismiss on the basis of standing, and that motion was granted. But we have had conversations with various folks. I will say that initially in 2018, we had reached out to the Director of Elections and the Secretary of State, and through negotiations with their attorney, the Director of Elections, Maria Matthews, who is a defendant now and was a defendant in 2018, did send out the letter a letter along the lines that we requested. It was a bit watered down, but it would have been better than nothing. It did tell them that about the federal law, but then it had some, consult with your local attorney about compliance.
Some wiggle room.
Yeah, but then all hell broke loose. Those that were not complying went to the Director of Elections, and a subsequent notice went out that said, well, you don't really have to do anything. Uh, if you
Yeah,
if you don't want.
So Susan mentioned to me earlier today that, so Susan, maybe you can explain this to me again, how you actually tried to get all the ballot images in 2018, and then there was sort of an email exchange that was called to your attention, maybe in relation to your request.
Yes, Jenny, that's right. In 2018, I did request from every supervisor of elections, all 67 Florida counties, copies of their ballot images. And apparently that started a little flurry of communications amongst the supervisors, or at least with a man who is the director of the State Association of Supervisors of Elections, named Ron Labasky. And Ron Labasky sent an email to all the supervisors that contained complete misinformation. He said he told them that he had consulted with ES&S, which is Election Systems and Software, which counts the majority of votes in Florida.
It's a vendor, right? A voting machine vendor.
Voting machine vendor, thank you.
Mhm.
And that ES&S, Election Systems and Software, had told him that the supervisors had choices. They could either create all the ballot images, create only write-in ballot images, or create none. Well, of course, as you just said, Jenny, so clearly, they are automatically created. They're already created, so that they do not have a choice to do that. And interestingly, that memo, or his email to all the supervisors, was dated November 1st, 2018. On the same date, Ron Labasky sent an email to all the, Ron Labasky's email went out. There was an ES&S memo dated November 1st, 2018, which one would construe as probably the memo that Ron Labasky had looked at to write his memo. And the ES&S memo said, save the images, save all, save only the write-ins, or save none. So it appears that Mr. Labasky looked at the ES&S memo, changed the wording, because ES&S has never said, ever, 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 that they have a choice of creating the images. So that was pulled out of thin air, and for the purpose of allowing them to get out of saving them.
Right, and there's no such thing as creating. They're already automatically created. And even ES&S, and I'm no fan of ES&S, even they did not claim that they needed to be created. They just said you could save them.
John will get into this in a minute. There is confusion that is caused by the machines themselves, because they provide choice, and but the choice has to do with the preservation, not the creation. And Labasky capitalized on the opportunity to confuse some of these supervisors of elections in Florida, with the exception of Miami-Dade. All of the supervisors of elections are elected. Very few of them, there are some that are, but very few of them are actually election specialists. They're politicians. And
Right.
When we were doing the recount in 2018 in front of the Broward County Canvass Board, the dreaded Brenda Snipes came to testify. We asked her to testify, even though she's technically a member of the canvassing board, but she had assigned one of her workers to fill her spot. She came and she brought her consultant with her. She didn't know anything.
Right.
He answered the question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, part of the problem is that the people in charge that have authority many of them really know nothing.
Right. And Brenda Snipes was the supervisor of elections in Broward County. Is that right?
She's the former supervisor.
She was at the time. She was.
Yeah.
She's been replaced. She ended up being kind of, the Republicans blamed her for all of the problems that occurred in Florida. She may have caused some of them, certainly. I mean, I'm sure she did.
I'd like to speak up and defend
Sure.
a lot of the supervisors in Florida, though. Although they're elected, there are really, truly many fine supervisors of elections in Florida. They have technical staffs. many of them do a really great job. But that said, the state does not give them good guidance often. And
Actually, oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
no. Yeah, no, that's okay. Chris is right that I'll just say one more sentence, which just is that Chris is right that most of them are, in some sense, politicians, and that personally they may not have a lot of knowledge. Some of them really work hard to get the right technical advice, but there is a lot of misinformation that gets circulated in Florida to the supervisors, and I think they sometimes are victims of either Mr. Lepasky or the state.
Right. Well,
and some are going to be better than others, right? So I don't think anyone would say that Brenda Snipes was knocking herself out to do a stellar job. Debate whether
I think that there are a lot of not to get too far afield, but there is they are way overloaded. They are, and this is a chronic problem throughout the country. They are understaffed. They're undertrained. And they try, as we put out, I'm quoted in the press release, they want to do the right thing for the most part. They would like to do the right thing, but they don't get the guidance from the Secretary of State, which is the basis of the lawsuit, and they often get improper information. That said, I think if most of them came from a background of election administration, it would be better. Having worked all over the country, I can tell you that Florida election administration in Florida is near the bottom in terms of quality. So, that, and personally, I think that's because they are not, they don't come from a background of election administration.
Interesting.
Some of them do.
Oh, it looks like Benny wanted to jump in.
Yeah. If I could say something to Chris's point about these election supervisors that are running for these seats, election administration and elections crosses into a number of different professions. So even if they had, absolute knowledge about electioneering, there is software, there is procedural, there are so many other different industries, budgeting, finance. There's so many other things that I, as a sitting election commissioner, realize that there is no possible way for somebody running, or even somebody like myself who is very technical, to know the nuance that happens in elections. So I always say it, we don't have locks on our homes because we don't trust our neighbors. We have them so we don't have to. And
exactly.
These laws, it's not that we don't trust any administrators or even trust the process or distrust the process. We want the transparency so we don't have to. So
right. And it's also not just about us, right? It's about a lot of voters in a very part. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
These administrators and supervisors, they can look at this law, they can look at all of this existing stuff that is on the books, and they don't have to be experts. All they have to be is law abiders, and they can just follow the law, and this would make a lot of this unnecessary. We wouldn't have to have Chris swinging his heavy bat at something that should be easily complied with.
And the law is the ballot image preservation.
Yeah.
Right. And that way the public can conduct its own.
The record is created, you must preserve it, no matter what that record is. If you don't want to preserve the record, then don't create it.
And
this one is created, therefore you must preserve it.
And then the second part of it is that they must make it publicly available so that the public doesn't have to trust election officials. They can conduct their own recounts and their own manual audits. Is that right?
Yeah, and John says it all the time. Casting the ballot, that's the secret process. Counting it, that's public. And we have large problems when we mix these two P's together. Public means public elections, publicly funded with proprietary, private software. You can't tell the public that they can't see what they paid for. And that is where we get into the rub of some very publicly created records that all of the taxpayers paid for from a private vendor that says, now I don't want you to see how I counted what you did. And that's just problem.
Right. So, John, something that struck me from the press release was there was a mention of a self-destruct mechanism in some of these ballot scanners. Can you explain that?
Well, let's put it this way. Is Chris is the one who stimulated me to go through all the manuals because we know how the system works. And after going through all the manuals, I can see that there's some form of Orwellian language there that they try to say that this process is simultaneously. And the images really are like, there, but they don't want to describe it in all these manuals. And I spent 15 hours going through a lot of manuals. And after realizing this, when it says to save only the write-in images, is what it's saying is destroy everything else.
Oh,
Save
I
one,
see.
destroy all. Okay?
So it actually gives an option to, instead of just saving all of them, they're created automatically, but they're not saved automatically.
Right. Because like I said, the ballot goes in the machine, and then it takes a picture, and then it uses algorithms and programs to read these things, the X, Y coordinate, and all of this is done in temporary memory. Now, it's in temporary memory until the ballot is done, and if there's an overvote, it will stop, and it will say to the person at the other side of the machine, oh, you overvoted. Do you want this ballot back? And they can say yes. And then the ballot will come back, and all of that work that was done is discharged. It's not going to be saved, okay? But if the person says, no, I purposely overvoted, and they push the button, the ballot drops in the box, and that's when the transfer of the ballot images is supposed to go to the thumb drive or the hard drive of the 850, okay? Instead, it stays.
And what's an 850? Sorry, stop if I could interrupt you right there. What's an 850?
The 850, the DS850 is a high-speed scanner. It counts 9,000 ballots per minute. It's mostly used on recounts or vote by mail.
Okay.
What it is. And by the way, if they put the inkjet back into that machine, it would marry the ballot image to the ballot, because when they run high-speed scanners, they don't sort ballots. As they come in, they just run them. They let the computer do the sorting. And that means if you have a large county and you have 1,000 precincts, and each box has 1,000 ballots, you can have one ballot from each precinct in a box. And there's no way to audit that, okay? But with these images, you can. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah,
But
It does, but let me just see if I understand it right. So at the end of voting, the election officials will have a choice as to whether to save all of the images or only save the write-ins or only save, no.
that decision is made 40 days out.
Yeah, let me take a stab at it, John. It's
Okay.
it's a setting that when the ballot is cast, there has to be some committal of what the final result per ballot is. That is materialized in an image, right? Because that is what is used to create the total, right? So when you're deciding on if you overvoted or undervoted, that's just cycling through. The computer is saying, I'm gonna start over. Let me give you another chance. Do you got it? Nope, start over. Do you got it? Once you finally got it, then that's the only thing that the computer needs to keep, because that's what you're submitting. So the submission is then enshrined by taking a selfie of what was the last thing that was fed to it for that particular vote. Then the ballot drops into the box. The image is now stored. The setting is, that's where the setting can say, do you want to keep that or do you only want to keep the write-ins? So if you want to keep the whole image, do I want to keep whole or part? That's really what it's saying. I can take a picture of the whole ballot, or I can just take a picture of everything you wrote in. And this is where you can discard 90% of the ballot and only keep 10%.
Jenny, could I jump in for a second?
Sure,
Jenny?
Susan. Susan, why don't you go ahead? So we're still talking about this self-destruct.
Yeah, okay.
So this is go ahead. This is a setting though that the election officials decide before the election. Then what?
Yes.
When the election is programmed, they have a choice at that time whether to save all, save only write-ins, or save none. And they have to do that before they do their logic and accuracy testing, which then after that, they're not allowed to reprogram the election in any way. So this is all decided long before the election itself. And then in answer, just to elaborate on what John said, because this was sort of John's awareness, and then we all went, oh yeah, that's right. You know, when you say save none, you're really saying destroy all.
Right.
And that's what John means by self-destruct mechanism, is when 40 days before the election, when they choose that save none option, it might as well say destroy all ballot images.
It's
And they're
in
just
effect a
okay.
product defect. And a couple
Yeah, it sounds like it. It
Don
does
and
sound like a product defect.
Don
Yeah.
and I talked about bringing a lawsuit against ES&S
Please do.
on the grounds that they were marketing and selling equipment that was not in compliance with federal law.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you know, it's hard enough to win these
So-
lawsuits.
So I want to interject here. Like ES&S has very auditable hardware and software. It's just that it's so configurable that if you don't want to be, if you want to be a bad actor, it will enable you to be one. That's where the rub is. If
Oh,
you
boy.
don't, if you want to do something and you don't want it to be saved, you now have the option to say, "Oh, leave it alone. Don't count it." That's the part that where the real attack is, and where you see the most malfeasance is when you have the ability to turn off something that statutorily cannot be, that has to be preserved, and you choose willingly in advance, and there's a configuration setting. I will configure my election to disobey the law.
yeah,
And the ES&S has the
Wow.
problem with deniability because they say, well, we put all the features in
What-
there.
Yeah, it shouldn't.
what is ironic about that is in at least some of the ES&S operational materials, they cite the federal law.
Yeah.
So even though they're telling their users that there's this federal law, they're giving them the opportunity not to comply with the federal law.
Oh boy, it's like a wink and a nod, a little
And if
wink.
I could just add to that, something very profound that really woke me up in 2016 is that I challenged my own county and sued them.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
judge was very profound, and he wasn't a geek. And this is what he said, and this is very memorable. He said, you know, Pima County, I'm not computer literate, but if you take voted ballots and you photocopy them and you use the photocopies to count the vote, then he said, what makes you think you can destroy them?
Right.
You,
Yeah.
you can't.
Yeah.
And he ruled
Yeah.
right from the bench.
That's the whole duplicate ballot argument, which we actually, we made it in the federal. I'm getting these complaints a little bit confused, but we've made that argument on a number of occasions, and it's a practical argument that the judges understand, because many of them have encountered the duplicate ballot situation when a ballot comes in the mail and it's been damaged or torn and it won't go through the scanner. The election officials make an identical duplicate, so one will run through the machine. They are supposed to, and all of it. I've never encountered a county that didn't have this instruction. They are supposed to keep both of them. Mark one, exhibit, and the other one exhibit A1 or exhibit 1 and exhibit 1A, and keep them together in the case of a recount or a contest or an audit, that they can then whoever is doing that audit or recount can look at that and they can figure it out. So they know how to do that. They just don't know how to do the ballot images.
Yeah, there's something I wanted to just chime in, because I know we talk about how the majority of election officials want to do the right thing and are good actors, but I do think that there are a few exceptions, and unfortunately, sometimes they tend to be in the swing states. I'm not even referring to Florida at the moment. I'm thinking specifically of John Husted when he was the Secretary of State of Ohio, and how, this is a guy who in 2012 was caught by an attorney, Bob Fitrakis. He was caught having allowed ES&S to install uncertified software throughout the state of Ohio in 2012. And then in 2016, he set those, he had those scanners set to delete the ballot images. Is that right, John? And he actually won in court. There was this horrible judge, this horrible, really right-wing mean-spirited judge who, I looked him up, and he's also made fun of, an inmate who was subjected to really cruel and unusual punishment. You got a really awful judge who allowed Husted to things on the self-destruct setting. Is that right, John?
That case was early on after I did Arizona, okay? And they called it a security thing, and they got it kind of screwed, and the language was all wrong. And we went back and worked with Bob, and then Chris and Bob and some others put a case together. And I'll let Chris explain the Ohio finally case, because we got them to save, supposedly. We need to go back and work
In
to find out if
2016?
they really are.
I'm sorry, John, in 2016, they saved the images?
No, we lost them in 16.
Yeah.
But we went back.
With the same, with John Husted, as to your original point, I don't put secretaries of state in the same category as local election officials.
Okay.
Most of whom I think do want to do the right thing. They do. Susan's absolutely right. Most of them do work very hard, but they're under a lot of strain and pressure, and
Right.
their staff and so forth. Secretaries of state, many of them are even more so than the politicians who run for supervisor elections, way more so. They are politicians who are looking for the next office. And
they're often vote suppressors. I mean,
yeah, and so
that's vested into that category.
Yeah, I don't put secretaries of state in, although there have been in Washington state, for example, the secretaries of state, there's a long tradition of good secretaries of state of both parties there. And but this polarization that's happened in the last 20 years didn't really touch Washington state, but almost every other state it has touched. And so the secretaries of state in most states, the Republican secretaries of state, tend to be, to some degree or another, tend to be vote suppressors. But what happened in 2018 is we filed the first case after Arizona. Well, the first case that I was on was the Alabama special election between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. And in that case, we sued only the Secretary of State.
Who is John Merrill? Is that right?
John Merrill. And
Republican.
We went to court in the heart of Dixie in front of a judge who had been appointed by the Republican governor. And after both sides presented, he said, well, looking at the counsel for the Secretary of State and the counsel for the Attorney General, they were co-counsel in this case. Well, I only have one question. What is the public cost? And they said de minimis. And then he ruled for us and said to us, counsel, would you please draw up the order? So, and this guy was a young judge.
I thought you lost in Alabama.
No,
12 hours later.
no, we won in the trial court.
Oh, and then it was reversed. Okay.
They appealed to Roy Moore's colleagues on the Alabama Supreme Court. Alabama Supreme Court stayed the order through the election, which was the same as losing. It went up on appeal.
In 12 hours.
Ruled against.
I'm sorry. What, Benny? What are you trying to say?
That stay happened within 12 hours of the ruling.
Well, not only did it happen quickly, but it actually happened the next day. But no, it actually, I think, yeah, it happened the next day, Monday. No, we got the order on Friday, and it happened on the Monday. But the interesting thing about that was that it was done ex parte. The hearing was ex parte. They notified us as they were walking into the chambers.
Yeah.
We literally got our copy of their appeal about 2 or 3 minutes before the order was issued. So, but that's
the great
Alabama.
irony of it.
So then in Ohio, we filed a similar case, and it was a mandamus we went to the Supreme Court rather than to a local court. And the Supreme Court ended up ruling after the election, but before the election, John Husted issued a directive to all the election officials, the local election officials, to preserve the ballot images. So we ended up losing in the Supreme Court, even though Husted issued the
But
directive.
you got the relief.
So we got the
Lost, but you
relief.
won.
Yeah.
That's good. That's something. I mean, what I was going to say just briefly about what happened in Alabama, the great irony there was that the Republicans were the ones who were, John Merrill and the Republican Supreme Court were the ones who who wanted to destroy these images. And ultimately, when the Democrat won, Roy Moore's people wanted those images. And I don't know if it was you guys who told me or Roy Moore's son reached out to me at one point because they were trying to figure out if there was a way that they could contest the outcome.
Roy Moore issued a tweet afterwards criticizing the Supreme Court.
Yep.
And the Secretary of State.
Yeah, they ended up wanting those images because they did not trust themselves.
Why are you destroying the ballot images or the election?
And there's something I want to say there. It's not clear at all that they thought that the Democrats did anything to rig that election. I think Roy Moore was worried about Karl Rove because Karl Rove and Roy Moore have a long history of criticizing each other. And Karl Rove was very much has roots in Alabama, and he very much did not want Roy Moore to win that election. He had wanted Luther Strange as the Republican nominee. But I digress.
Yeah.
I just thought it was a really interesting.
We just put a pin in that on the reason why we are such a nonpartisan board, organization. This was the Republican establishment against an incumbent Republican that they had fallen out of favor with.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
That was the entire case.
Go ahead. Sorry, Benny.
Yeah, and we didn't care who it was. We just want the loser to actually be the one who lost and the winner to be the actual one who won.
And for the public to know that the person who won really won, and the public to know that the person who lost really lost.
Now I will.
I did want to.
I mean, that is.
It looks like John wants to say something. Hey, John, go ahead.
Is that me and Chris and Susan and Benny somewhat, because we communicate. When I'm in a state, they're really with me. Okay.
Right.
And we've been now in 19 states, and of course, I never thought I'd get involved in Tennessee. Okay, and then Benny called me one day, and I just couldn't believe what we've uncovered there, which has now led to putting the cherry on our investigation, and then Chris and other lawyers working together to now ask for a congressional investigation on these findings. But the big thing that when I go into an election department, the big thing that I work for now is that cynicism is destroying our country. 107 million people in the 2016 election, 44% of the public didn't vote. And a lot of these people I accuse of belonging to the Mark Twain party. That's the party that believed that if voting made a difference, they wouldn't let us do it. Okay? And so why participate? And I think it's very important that, thank you for the Democratic Party jumping in, is that we do need to prove that elections are real. This game of democracy only works if we all participate, okay, or most of us, and have an understanding and believe that it's real. And that's what we're trying to do. And
by the way, there are
problems of our country.
Right. Arizona is preserving, as a result of John's lawsuit, is preserving by law the ballot images. The problem there and in North Carolina is the accessibility to the ballot. You've got to get them.
We've preserved them, but you can't see them. Is that what they're doing?
You've got to get a court order in Arizona. Although there's now one of John's friends is now in Maricopa County as the chief elections officer, and he's very sympathetic to the idea of making the ballot images available to citizens. In North Carolina, either a court or the election board has to issue an order. In Maryland, they use ballot images as a part of their canvass. And in recounts, they make the ballot images available to the parties. And that works, at least for those parties. I'm not aware of citizens trying to get those ballot images. Maybe,
But
but
yeah, I think there's probably not enough citizens who
but
know that
but
they're an option.
but they do use the ballot images in a very constructive way. And in Virginia, as a result of our threat to file a lawsuit, they issued directives to the election officials to preserve the ballot images. We need to follow up and make sure that they're following that directive.
Right.
But
If I could,
That's terrific. Hey guys, if we could, well, go ahead. Did you want to say something, Benny?
in Maryland, I've been loosely associated with a request that has been made for ballot images from a candidate that ran.
No, Eli.
They're actually going to give them the image.
Yep, looks like Susan wanted to chime in
Here,
there.
Kitty. I think she's saying here. Kitty.
Oh, I'm
Susan needs to mute.
I thought I was on mute.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I would like to say one
So
thing.
I did want to just turn back to Florida because Florida has historically, been such a disaster as far as election integrity and such a pivotal state. And I kind of wanted to go over why in Florida, of all places, it's particularly important that the public has access to ballot images so that the public can provide some oversight. And, so for example, in the 2000 election, I don't know how many people know this, but there was something known as the Volusia error. And Susan, I was hoping that you could explain just briefly what that was. Volusia County is, by the way, a county in Florida. Susan, are you there?
Yes, Volusia County is what, Jenny? I didn't hear the last thing.
Oh, it's a county in Florida. I was hoping you could just
Yes,
explain what the Volusia error was.
Yes. So in 2000, on election night, and I live in Volusia County, but in the 2000 election, a precinct with only 385 voters, I think it was, subtracted 16,022 votes for Al Gore and added approximately 2,500 votes for George Bush. And at that time, that was just about the total. If you total the plus votes for Bush and the minus votes for Gore, was 18,000, and Gore was ahead by 21,000. So when they subtracted that, it made it look almost like a tie, and they changed the call in Florida from Al Gore to not knowing, and Volusia County never released the corrected results until early morning, when they had actually called the election for George Bush, and then Volusia corrected its problem. And that's when Al Gore withdrew his concession. When Volusia finally corrected that problem, they went, holy cow, this is not so far off. This is really, really close.
And this was noticed only because a poll worker happened to notice Gore's vote total going down, which on the central tabulator, I guess, is that where she was looking, or where was the poll worker? Do you know?
Well, that's that. It's not a poll worker. It was at the elections office. They uploaded a memory card that had already been uploaded, and it started doing these weird things to the vote total, and she was like, what's going on? I don't know what's going on. So they knew there was a problem early. By 9 or 10 in the evening. They corrected it shortly thereafter, but they never reported the correction until the wee hours.
And the thing that really also struck me about that, well, Kim Zetter, who's a really terrific cybersecurity journalist, did a piece for the New York Times a couple of years ago, and she went into the Volusia error and pointed out that it was blamed on a memory card error, but she said, typically a memory card error wouldn't subtract votes from just one candidate and add them to the libertarian and add votes to a libertarian candidate, that the explanation really didn't make much sense, and that there was actually a second phantom card that was referenced in the logs for that election that was never really explained. There
actually wasn't a phantom. We really must put out a report on that. There actually is not a phantom second card. What happened is they accidentally uploaded a card that had already been uploaded, and there was a buffer overflow, but it is very strange that it only affected the presidential race. That part, buffer overflow, anything else, it's and the poll tapes actually show something like 49,000 votes in that one precinct for Al Gore. It's a crazy. We have all the numbers all figured out, but it's it and how it came up with that 16,022.
And
But
the other thing with Volusia County, though, was that that's also Tom Feeney his district was in Volusia County, and Tom Feeney is he was a close ally of I think it was Jeb Bush, and he's the guy that, according to the now I'm blanking on it, Clint Curtis. He's the guy that Clint Curtis later testified under oath had asked him to design a vote flipping program. That was Feeney, who's from Volusia. So anyway, it's all very suspicious. And this was an election that was won by how many votes, John? This 2000 election in Florida?
300. What was it?
I think it was 527, right, Susan?
yeah, yeah.
And in Florida, and we never got a full recount in 2000. Karl Rove, who's by the way currently now working with Trump, I don't know if he orchestrated it, but he certainly wasn't far apart from the Brooks Brothers riot, which that was a bunch of Republican operatives who dressed up in suits to stop the recount. And I think that we may experience the same type of thing if we try to get a recount or need a recount in November 2020. We can expect the same type of opposition that we saw in 2000 and that we saw in 2016. The Trump administration stopped any kind of meaningful manual recount in 2016. And so yeah, the last thing I wanted to mention about Florida, where we have specific election integrity concerns there having to do with wireless modems that were installed in ES&S's ballot scanners. And John, could you explain that a little bit? Because I know that you did a lot of the early work that discovered wireless modems in Wisconsin and then later discovered them in Florida.
Yeah, it's I'll never forget that night that me and Chris were in Milwaukee during the recount. And I was kind of kidding around, and I said to the election administrator, gee, with your precincts, how do you bring the results in? Do you use a soft shoe network? I mean, that's where they take the thumb drive and the ballots, put them in a bag and seal them and walk them in? Or do you use a phone modem, or do you use a SIM card? And he said, SIM card. And I was in shock. I walked away and I said, Chris, I can't believe what he said. So then the next day, we were in Waukesha. And they say if you're in a bad elections in Wisconsin, you've been Waukesha'd. Okay? Well, we were in Waukesha. Okay? And there, we found it. And we couldn't, and
you found what? What did you find? I'm sorry.
Yeah, they were using wireless modems. And they're built into the system.
And these connect the scanners to the internet. Is that correct?
Well, it's a virtual private network, and you have to question what does virtual mean. And I also call it the insiders network because it violates the chain of custody. Okay, you can't have these systems and have an honest system because one person can have the password to get in and cause mischief that you won't believe.
Well, and this was also just the big scam after the 2016 election. We had all these people, including James Comey, telling the public that we didn't have to worry about hacking in any substantial sense because voting machines never connect to the internet. And yet these ballot scanners in places like Wisconsin and Florida, actually ES&S either shipped or installed itself wireless modems, I believe starting around 2015 is what I found from my own research, or actually my friend Michelle found from her research. And so they put these wireless modems in which connect both the scanners to the internet and the systems on the receiving end of those transmissions, which would presumably include the central tabulators, which just is an opportunity for internet hackers to transmit malware or to monitor vote totals, by the way.
Yeah, once again, ES&S built equipment that accommodated something that shouldn't have been. And so this equipment was built so that these wireless communications could be made. And it was not fully exposed until Senator Ron Wyden finally got an ES&S executive, I don't know if it's the president or one of the executives, to concede that yes, in fact, after years of denial, yes, this is what this is what we do. We no longer manufacture this kind of equipment, he said.
Oh, no, you're thinking, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you're thinking of the remote access is what they said they no longer do. But the wireless modems are new. So they stopped with the remote access, but then they started adding in
remote control.
15.
But it was Wyden that got them to admit that indeed this existed after years of denial.
Hey, John.
Yeah, I think so. It's certainly he got them to admit the remote access.
I got one for John. John, when you and Chris were in Florida, didn't you film the modem?
He did.
I think you muted. John, you're mute. You're snoozed.
John, the mute button is your enemy.
I'm sorry.
I mean, again, John. When we were in, you and Chris were in Florida in 2018, didn't you film the actual modems there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I turned that old film over to Who, What, and Why, and worked with them on their story, and it was quite an outstanding story, and went all across the country, and on that, it's a bad situation, but I want to say that one thing that me and Benny know, and is because we know that a program like Fraction Magic can change the numbers on the fly, but it cannot change a hand-marked paper ballot that's married to a ballot image. So theoretically, if you are a hacker, you don't want to get caught. You want to steal with impunity. So you must destroy the ballot images. You make the ballots very hard to count. And then if there is a recount, this country does recounts on the same software that counted it the first time. And Einstein said doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different solution when you got fraction magic, if you knew that, would be insanity.
Right. I mean, that's the thing is experts say that the only way to know for sure if an electronic tally is legitimate is to conduct a full manual recount of the paper ballot or a robust manual audit. And for the most part, we don't do either. And
that's right.
Counts that were sought in 2016 by the Green Party, I wish the Democrats had stood up and sought manual recounts. But those were, for the most part, blocked. Most large Wisconsin counties refused to do it. The Pennsylvania court denied the manual recount. And in Michigan, it was shut down after 3 days and had all these crazy exceptions for like machines with broken seals. We don't want to recount those ballots. And it had an exception, if the number of votes and number of voters didn't match up, we don't want to recount those. So that's a real problem in the United States that I think the public doesn't appreciate is that we, for the most part, have unconfirmed election outcomes, and we cannot do this again going into the 2020 election. And that's why the work of Audit USA is so crucial. And that's why this work is so crucial is that even when we have what I advocate and what you guys advocate, hand-marked paper ballots, oftentimes we don't get manual recounts and we don't have candidates who fight for those manual recounts. So the citizens, the public, and groups like yours are really our last line of defense, and you're trying to provide some kind of oversight that even our own candidates haven't been fighting for the most part, which is also why I was so excited that the Florida Democratic Party had joined your lawsuit. And I can't thank you enough for doing this work. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about or that we haven't that you want to address?
I think is important. Is that,
go ahead, John.
It is important that when we approach our brothers and sisters who work in elections, that we go in there and what I do is I say, hi, my name is John Brakey, and I'm here because I want to help more people vote because cynicism is destroying our country. And that's something that they can agree on. Rather than going in and saying, I don't trust your system, I don't like ES&S or whatever. No, I go in there, to be able to build that relationship and try to win these people over, okay? Because, a lot of them are in group think land, okay? A guy like Ron Biabaski can write a letter and say, yeah, that doesn't work that way. Don't believe Susan or Brakey or Chris and hang your hat on this, okay?
Right, and a lot of times it's not go ahead, I'm sorry.
And build a relationship. It's sad to say when I ask an election person, I say, gee, how do you know your election results are good? Oh, I ran a logic and accuracy test. And I say, oh, is that like that Volkswagen test? Because they both do one thing. These are two tests that's supposed to prove that everything is working right. When we know that Volkswagen passed missions in this country maybe 1 million times over 10 years and passed every time, and they had a computer in there that knew when to cheat.
Right. So the logic and accuracy testing is often what they say proves
Yeah.
that their equipment is sound, and yet it can be manipulated to work one way during the logic and accuracy testing and a different way during the actual election. So they don't know that because oftentimes the vendors.
Source code will do that.
Yeah, there actually was something else I wanted to ask you guys about, because oftentimes I don't necessarily think the county election officials often are not what we have to worry about. It sometimes wasn't there an IT person in Florida who was discovered there was a ransomware attack
I'll call you right back.
before the 2016 election, and it turned out he was keeping pornography on his computer.
Sir. Thank you. Bye.
I don't know where it was, but I do remember a story where the exploitation happened to somebody who was in the election.
Yeah, and we found out about it only recently. I don't know.
Yeah,
then we have the FBI say.
I remember reading it.
Yeah, we don't have any kind of transparency when it comes to our elections, and even we have the FBI has finally agreed that it will tell election officials if there's been a breach, or state election officials. It wasn't telling them that before; it was only going to tell the vendors, and now they're saying, okay, we'll tell state election officials, but there's no agreement to tell the public. And much of what happened in 2016, which was, Florida, at least their voter registration systems were hacked and penetrated by Russia, but there is no consensus that our government will tell the public when these types of breaches occur, and that's just unacceptable.
Jenny,
So,
what you said again about the Florida IT official, because I got distracted by John's phone call, and I think it was important for your Zoom thing when you edit it to have that whole statement.
Yeah, do you remember what happened with the IT guy where there was a ransomware attack, and it turned out he was keeping porn on his child pornography on his computer, and he was in, I don't remember which county it was. Do you remember?
I remember, but I don't remember the county. No, I don't remember, Jenny. Sorry, after all, asking you.
No, it's okay. It's all right. I'll look it up later.
I'd like to say, if I could.
Sure. Yes, please do.
Well, so the one thing I wanted to just say is that in Dane County, Wisconsin, they post the ballot images on their website.
There's a reason for that, by the way.
That's right.
When John and I visited, we were making the rounds in 2016. And we got to know a little bit the clerk there. That's the chief county election officer. We spent some time in Dane, which is Madison, and we basically suggested it. And wouldn't it be a good idea to post the ballot images? And he said, "That's a great idea." And he hadn't thought of it, or he at least indicated he hadn't thought of it until we suggested it. So. That goes to John's point about how it's important to try to develop a line of communication.
Sure, not to go in assuming nefarious intent.
And to respect them, to give them some respect. Obviously, when you're in an adversarial situation in a recount or something else, that's not always possible. But when you first go in advance of an election and try to meet with the local election officials, which is always a good idea because you learn lots of things that you wouldn't otherwise know by talking to them. And they sometimes reveal things they shouldn't.
Right.
Sometimes things end up like in Dane County where they end up posting the ballot images because of a very cordial conversation about ballot images and about their recount.
And so if anybody would like to see those, it's Dane County, like Great Dane, D-A-N-E, Dane County, Wisconsin. You go to their website, there's an audit tab on the top left. You click on that, scroll down to do-it-yourself audit. And they have all the ballot images posted from all the different elections. It's very cool.
Thank you. That's really helpful. That's great, Susan. I found what I was thinking of here from one of my tweets. It was in February of 2020, Miles Parks, who is a journalist for NPR, broke the story that the elections office of Florida's third most populous county, which is Palm Beach, was breached by a crippling cyber attack in the weeks leading up to the 2016 election. And there's no indication that it was connected to Russian interference efforts. But let's see, it came to light during a Palm Beach Post editorial board review with County Election Supervisor Wendy Sartori. And it turned out that the IT guy in Palm Beach County was keeping child pornography on his computer, and he handled the ransomware attack himself. And we don't know how he handled it. He resolved it somehow himself. Many details remain unclear, including how much data the attackers were able to access and lock up, whether money was paid to unlock it. And this just goes to show again that we need public oversight of Florida elections and of elections throughout the country.
Look, it should be transparent. If you have a process that's transparent, then anybody who wants to assume that all people are bad or all people are good, it doesn't matter which one you choose. You can go and find out and authenticate it because the process is transparent.
Thank you, Benny. And I think on that note, I think we are done. Thank you guys so much for all of your work and for letting me talk to you about your new lawsuit. And I wish you luck on the lawsuit. I hope that you prevail.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Jenny.
you for your good work. Okay, you know, I've come to really admire you over the years for your pit bullness. I see that you're part of our family. Okay.
Oh, thanks, John.
And we're very grateful for people who get in the trenches with us. You know, that's where we really get to know who we are. I always like when I go into a state, if I can organize a small retreat, bring in 3 or 4 other activists and bond. It's a great thing to be able to do. And in closing, I can say one thing is John F. Kennedy was right. One person can make a difference and everybody should try. I look in my 16 years of work and I look in a mirror and I'm really proud of who I see, what I stand up for. And I'm proud of the association with Benny, with Chris, Susan, you, and many other great Americans who are fighting to make our democracy work and get everybody back in the game and build that confidence back and turn away this problem that we're having in our election system by just doing something very simple, make it transparent.
Yeah, and then we're going to give Jenny a donate button because she be putting all this work in, and some people should thank her monetarily for all the work she puts in.
Yeah, that'd be good.
I didn't quite hear that. Were you referring to me or to Susan?
Donate
either way.
Jenny.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate that. And thank you to you and to Audit USA. And we will be, I'll probably have one or more of you back on as your lawsuit progresses and as more information is unearthed, because it's really important, I think, to not just report the story once and then just let it go. I think it's really important to stay with the story and keep repeating it. So thank you again, guys, and we will talk soon.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.